The candles had been lit an hour ago, and the table was set for 14. Sylvie Calder, Duchess of Ashmore, stood at the far end of the dining room and counted the place settings twice, though she had already confirmed them with Mrs. Holt that morning. 14 chairs, 14 arrangements of silver and crystal and bone china, each positioned with the precision that Ashmore House demanded of its staff and its mistress alike. She touched the edge of a wine glass, adjusted it a quarter-inch to the left, and let her hand fall to her side. The letter was in the pocket of her gown. She had found it 3 days earlier in the second drawer of Edmund's writing desk, not hidden, not sealed, simply lying beneath a sheet of parliamentary correspondence as though it were nothing of consequence. A single page, folded once, written in Edmund's careful hand. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the household ledger, which Ferris had said Edmund had taken upstairs to review. The drawer had been slightly open. The page had caught her eye because the ink was fresh, and the paper was not the heavy stock Edmund used for House of Lords business, but the lighter cream-colored sheet he used for personal correspondence. She had read it standing at his desk with the afternoon light falling across her hands. It was a proposal. Not of marriage. Edmund was already married, and the law did not permit what the heart apparently entertained, but of something worse in its way. A proposal of devotion, a declaration written in the language of permanence, of future, of chosen attachment. Every sentence was crafted with the same deliberation Edmund brought to his speeches in the House of Lords, the same measured precision he used when addressing matters of estate policy with Ferris. He had not dashed this off in passion. He had composed it, revised it, perhaps. The handwriting was too even, too controlled for a man writing in the grip of feeling. The letter was addressed to Miss Adeline Price. Sylvie had read it once, then again, then folded it along its original crease and placed it back beneath the parliamentary papers. She had closed the drawer. She had found the household ledger on the shelf behind his chair, where Ferris had evidently returned it after Edmund had finished. She had taken the ledger downstairs, reviewed the quarter's expenses with Mrs. Holt, approved the linen order, and written 3 letters of her own before dinner. She had not cried. She had not, in fact, felt the urge to cry. What she had felt was something colder and more architectural, the sensation of a structure she had believed to be sound revealing, upon closer inspection, a fracture in its foundation. Not a collapse, a fracture. The distinction mattered to her. She had returned to the drawer the following morning when Edmund was at his club. The letter was still there. She had taken it. Now it was in her pocket, and the guests were arriving, and Miss Adeline Price was among them. Sylvie had invited her personally. The Prices were connected to the Ashmore circle through Lady Tremaine, who was Edmund's maternal aunt, and who had, for the past 2 seasons, made a project of Miss Price's social advancement. Miss Price was the daughter of a baronet, respectable but not distinguished, with a face that painters would call interesting rather than beautiful, and a manner that suggested she had been told from an early age that interesting was the more valuable currency. She was clever. Sylvie had always acknowledged this. She was well-read, sharp in conversation, and possessed of a laugh that seemed designed to make the person who had provoked it feel singularly gifted. Edmund had been its frequent recipient. Sylvie had watched this for months. She had watched it at the Harcourt Ball in February, and at Lady Tremaine's Easter supper, and at 3 separate afternoon calls in April. She had watched Edmund's posture change when Miss Price entered a room, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed, but Sylvie noticed. She noticed the way his shoulders settled, the way his voice dropped half a register, the way he turned his body toward Miss Price, the way a compass needle turns toward north. Small adjustments, involuntary ones, the kind of movements a man makes when he's not performing attraction, but experiencing it. She had told herself it was admiration, intellectual companionship. A man of Edmund's mind required stimulation that the duties of a marriage and a dukedom did not always provide. She had told herself this with conviction and had nearly believed it. The letter had ended the nearly. The guests gathered in the drawing room at 7:30. Sylvie wore pale gray silk, empire-waisted, with a strand of pearls that had belonged to Edmund's grandmother. Her hair was dressed simply, a low arrangement that showed the line of her neck and the set of her jaw, both of which were, tonight, very deliberate. She greeted each guest with the precise warmth that her position required, enough to convey welcome, not so much as to suggest she needed their approval. Edmund arrived from his study at 7:45, dressed in his evening tailcoat with a white cravat tied in the style he preferred. Simple, correct, entirely without flair. He kissed Sylvie's cheek in front of their guests, a gesture so practiced that it had long since ceased to be intimate and had become instead a piece of social choreography, like bowing or offering one's arm. She received it with a smile that matched his in its precision. Miss Price arrived with Lady Tremaine. She wore deep green, a color that suited her dark hair and made her look, Sylvie thought with detached clarity, exactly like the kind of woman a duke might write a letter to. She curtsied to Sylvie with impeccable form. Sylvie returned the greeting with a warmth that was, if anything, slightly greater than what she had offered the other guests. She saw the flicker of surprise in Miss Price's eyes and felt nothing at all. Dinner was announced. The party moved to the dining room. Sylvie had arranged the seating herself, Miss Price to Edmund's left, across from Sir Howard Beckford, who was tedious enough to make any neighboring conversation seem sparkling by comparison. Sylvie took her place at the opposite end of the table, 14 chairs away, where the candlelight caught the pearls at her throat and the pale silk of her gown. The first course was served. Conversation settled into its customary patterns. Politics among the men at Edmund's end, society gossip among the women near Sylvie's. She contributed to neither. She ate her soup with careful attention, listened to Lady Foskett's account of her daughter's engagement, and waited. She had decided, in the 3 days since finding the letter, that the waiting was essential. Not for dramatic effect, Sylvie had no taste for drama, but for clarity. She needed to be certain that when the moment came, her voice would be level, and her hands would be steady, and there would be no possibility of misinterpretation. She was not going to confront Edmund. Confrontation implied anger, and anger implied that she had been wounded, and she was not prepared to give him that. She was going to read. That was all. She was going to read aloud, as one might read a passage from a novel that had caught one's attention or a piece of correspondence that seemed relevant to the table's conversation. The second course arrived. Roast pheasant, dressed vegetables, a sauce that Mrs. Holt had discussed at length with the cook. Sylvie ate little. She could feel the letter against her thigh through the silk of her gown, the paper warm from her body, the edges softened from 3 days of being carried. Edmund was speaking to Miss Price. Sylvie could not hear the words from her end of the table, but she could see the angle of his body, the slight lean, the way his fingers rested on the stem of his wineglass without lifting it. Miss Price laughed, that particular laugh, the one that made its recipient feel chosen, and Edmund's mouth curved in response. Sylvie set down her fork. "I wonder," she said, and her voice carried the length of the table with the ease of a woman who had been trained to project, without raising her pitch, "whether the company might indulge me in a small reading." The table quieted. Not all at once. Conversations died in stages, closest to Sylvie first, then rippling outward until even Edmund and Miss Price turned their attention toward the far end. "I came across a piece of correspondence recently," Sylvie continued, reaching into the fold of her gown where the pocket was concealed beneath the drape of silk. Her fingers found the letter without hesitation. She drew it out, unfolded it, and held it in the candlelight. It struck me as remarkably well composed, the kind of writing one encounters so rarely in private letters, precise, considered, almost parliamentary in its construction. She glanced at Edmund. I thought it deserved a wider audience. Edmund's expression did not change. Not yet. He was watching her with the mild, polite attention of a host whose wife was making an unexpected contribution to the evening's entertainment. He did not recognize the paper. He could not, from 14 chairs away, see his own handwriting. Sylvie began to read. "My dearest Miss Price!" The name landed on the table like a stone dropped into still water. Sylvie saw it register, first on Miss Price's face, which went very white, and then on Edmund's, which went very still. Lady Tremaine's hand stopped halfway to her glass. Sir Howard Beckford looked up from his pheasant with the bewildered expression of a man who had not been following and was now, suddenly, riveted. Sylvie did not pause. Her voice remained exactly as it had been, clear, even, conversational. "I write to you not from obligation, but from certainty. You must know by now that my regard for you is not the passing admiration of a man entertained by clever company. It is something I have attempted to govern and have failed. You have become necessary to me, not in the way that air or sustenance is necessary, for those are things a man cannot choose to need, but in the way that music is necessary to the person who has once heard it played well. One can survive without it, one simply does not wish to." The silence in the room had acquired weight. Sylvie could feel it pressing against the walls, against the windows, against the careful arrangement of silver and crystal that she had adjusted that afternoon. She turned the page slightly to catch the candlelight and continued. I am aware of the constraints that bind me. I do not speak of divorce, for that is neither possible nor desired. I speak of devotion, the kind that exists not in defiance of duty, but alongside it, as a separate and private truth. I ask nothing of you that would compromise your standing or your honor. I ask only that you permit me to regard you as you deserve to be regarded, as the woman I would have chosen, had choice been available to me. Sylvie heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere to her left. Lady Foskett, perhaps, or Mrs. Alderman. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the letter, on Edmund's handwriting, on the careful loops and measured spacing of a man who had drafted and redrafted his betrayal until it met his standards of eloquence. You are the conversation I look forward to, the silence I find restful, the presence that makes every room more habitable. If this is presumption, I accept the charge. If it is devotion, I ask you to accept the offering, yours in whatever capacity you will permit. Edmund. Sylvie folded the letter along its original crease. She placed it on the table beside her plate, precisely aligned with the edge of her place setting. She picked up her wineglass, took a small sip, and set it down again. She said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. The letter had said everything, and she had merely been its instrument, a reader, nothing more. The words were his, the silence was hers. Edmund had not moved. His hands were flat on the table on either side of his plate, and his face had the quality of something carved, rigid, bloodless, absolutely controlled. He was looking at Sylvie across the length of the table, across the 14 place settings and the candelabra and the flower arrangements that she had approved that morning, and his expression was not anger or shame, but something Sylvie had never seen on his face before. Recognition. The slow, devastating recognition of a man who has been confronted not with an accusation, but with a mirror. Miss Price stood. Her chair scraped against the floor, a sound that in the silence seemed almost violent. She murmured something that might have been an apology or might have been nothing at all, and she walked out of the dining room with the careful, measured steps of a woman who was determined not to run. Lady Tremaine followed a moment later, her face the color of old parchment. The remaining guests sat in the particular stillness of people who understood that they had witnessed something they would be discussing for the remainder of the season, and who were, for the moment, too stunned to begin. Mrs. Alderman's hand was pressed flat against her collarbone. Colonel Whitfield, who had survived Waterloo and prided himself on composure under fire, was gripping his dessert spoon as though it were a weapon. Even the footmen had gone motionless along the walls, their training overridden by the simple human instinct to freeze in the presence of something unprecedented. Sylvie allowed the silence to hold for precisely long enough to ensure that everyone in the room understood its meaning. Then she broke it, not with an explanation, not with an apology, but with the one thing no one expected. Sylvie turned to Lady Foskett. "The pheasant is excellent tonight," she said. "Mrs. Holt sourced them from the Ashmore estate. The gamekeeper has had a remarkable year." Lady Foskett opened her mouth, closed it, and then with the instinct of a woman who had survived 40 years in society, said, "How fortunate. We must compliment the kitchen." The dinner continued. It was, by any external measure, a catastrophe, but Sylvie conducted the remainder of the evening with the serene efficiency of a woman who had simply shared an interesting piece of writing and was now enjoying her meal. She directed conversation toward safe harbors, the refurbishment of the pump room and bath, the new plantings at Kew, the expected attendance at Almack's the following Wednesday. The guests followed her lead with the desperate gratitude of drowning swimmers offered a rope. Edmund said nothing for the remainder of the meal. He ate mechanically, responded to direct questions with monosyllables, and did not look at Sylvie again. When the ladies withdrew after dinner, the gentlemen remained for port in a silence that even Sir Howard Beckford could not fill. The guests departed early. Lady Foskett was the first to call for her carriage, claiming a headache that no one believed and everyone was grateful for, because it gave the others permission to follow. Sir Howard Beckford lingered longest, as was his habit, seemingly unaware that the evening had contained anything unusual, or perhaps, Sylvie thought, simply too dense to recognize a detonation when it occurred at the dinner table rather than on a battlefield. He complimented the pheasant twice on his way out. Sylvie thanked him twice with identical warmth. She stood in the entrance hall as the last carriage pulled away, listening to the hooves on the gravel and the creak of wheels turning toward the London road. The night air came through the open door, cool for June, carrying the scent of the garden's climbing roses and the distant mineral smell of the Thames. She breathed it in. She let it fill her lungs and hold there for a moment before releasing it. Mrs. Holt appeared at the far end of the hall, her ring of keys catching the candlelight. "Shall I have tea brought to the drawing room, Your Grace?" "Yes, please. And Mrs. Holt, take your time clearing the dining room. There is no urgency." Mrs. Holt's expression did not change, but her eyes moved, a fractional shift that told Sylvie the housekeeper understood that this instruction was not about the clearing. "Of course, Your Grace." Sylvie closed the front door herself. The bolt slid into place with a sound that was, in the empty hall, surprisingly final. She was in the drawing room when Edmund entered. She was seated in the chair nearest the fire, not her usual chair, which was by the window, but the one that faced the door. She had chosen it deliberately. She was embroidering a corner of a handkerchief, a task so mundane, so domestic, that it served as its own kind of statement. She did not look up when he came in. She finished a stitch, set the needle down, and then raised her eyes. Edmund stood in the doorway. His cravat was loosened, the only sign of disorder she had ever seen on him. His hands were at his sides, and his face had the raw, stripped quality of a man who had spent the past 2 hours being forced to inhabit his own actions without the buffer of privacy. "Sylvie," he said. "Edmund, you read my letter." "I read your letter." He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers, not the chair he usually occupied, which was at his desk, but the one that faced her directly. He sat the way he sat in the House of Lords when a debate had gone against him, and he was preparing to concede ground, upright, hands on the arms of the chair, jaw set. "I will not ask how you found it," he said. "It was in your desk. I was looking for the household ledger. I should have destroyed it. You should not have written it." The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Holt was directing the clearing of the dining room, the faint sounds of silver and porcelain being gathered, the careful industry of a household that continued to function regardless of what its master and mistress did to each other. "I have not sent it," Edmund said. "I know. It was still in the drawer. I have not acted upon it. What the letter describes, the devotion, the regard, it exists. I will not deny that to you, not after what you have done tonight, but it has remained private. I have not touched her. I have not spoken to her in the terms that letter contains." "You composed it," Sylvie said. "You drafted it. You kept it. You intended to send it." "I do not know what I intended." "Then I will tell you what you intended, Edmund. You intended to offer another woman the words that belonged to your wife. Not because I had failed to earn them, but because you had failed to notice that I had." Edmund's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. It was the only movement he made, but Sylvie saw it, and she understood what it meant. He was not angry. He was holding himself in place. "You are correct," he said. "I know I am. What do you want?" It was, Sylvie thought, the first genuine question he had asked her in 2 years. Not a question of household management or social planning or the disposition of estate matters. The first question that emerged from the recognition that her answer mattered to him in a way he could not predict or control. "I want you to understand what you have," she said, "not what you imagined you wanted. What you have. I have managed your household. I have maintained your reputation. I have sat at your table and carried your name and represented your interests in every drawing room and assembly hall in London with a competence that you have never once acknowledged because it was so thorough that you mistook it for the natural order of things. I am not the natural order of things, Edmund. I am a choice I make every morning when I rise and attend to the life we share. I want you to see that." Edmund looked at her. The fire shifted, sending a wash of gold across the room that caught the gray silk of her gown and the pearls at her throat and the steady, unblinking composure of a woman who had read her husband's love letter to another woman in front of 14 guests and had not faltered once. "I see it," he said. "Do you?" "I see it now." Sylvie picked up her embroidery. She set 2 more stitches with hands that did not tremble, and then she said, without looking up, "Miss Price will not be received at Ashmore House again. Lady Tremaine will be informed tomorrow. You will write no letters of explanation, no apologies, no farewells. She will simply cease to be part of our circle. If she is encountered in society, you will be cordial and brief, and you will not seek her out. These are not requests." "I understand. Ferris will need to be told that your correspondence is to pass through me for the foreseeable future, not because I intend to read your letters, but because I intend for you to know that I could." Edmund nodded. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of a man who understood that the architecture of his marriage had shifted, and that the new arrangement, though uncomfortable, was entirely just. "The letter," he said. "The one you read tonight. Where is it?" "On the dining table. Where I left it." "May I have it?" "No. Mrs. Holt will find it when the table is cleared. She will read it because Mrs. Holt is thorough. She will say nothing because Mrs. Holt is discreet. And you will know that your housekeeper has read the words you wrote to another woman, and that knowledge will be more effective than any conversation I could have with you on the subject." Edmund closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something in his expression that Sylvie had not seen since the first months of their marriage, a vulnerability that he had, at some point, learned to conceal from her, and that was now, stripped of its covering, almost difficult to look at. "I have been a fool," he said. "You have been worse than a fool. You have been careless. A fool acts without thinking. You thought carefully and acted anyway." "Yes, that is harder to forgive." "I know, but not impossible." She said it quietly, without emphasis, and let it settle in the room alongside the fire and the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of the household continuing its nightly rituals. She did not say more. She did not need to. The sentence hung between them with the particular weight of a door left open, not an invitation precisely, but not a refusal either. A possibility. A conditional future. Edmund sat with her in silence for a long time. When he finally rose to retire, he paused at the door and said, "You were magnificent tonight." "I was not magnificent," Sylvie said. "I was accurate." He left. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured and slow, the footsteps of a man ascending toward a bedroom that contained only his own reflection and his own reckoning. She set down her embroidery and looked at the fire. She permitted herself then the one indulgence she had denied herself for 3 days. She pressed her hands together in her lap, very tightly, and held them there until the trembling stopped. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were honest, and honesty, Sylvie discovered, had a texture that comfort lacked, rough, unyielding, and strangely solid beneath the feet. Edmund withdrew from society for a fortnight. He cited parliamentary obligations, a convenient truth, as the House of Lords was indeed in session, and his attendance, which had been sporadic, became suddenly devout. But the withdrawal was real. He was not at his club. He was not at Lady Tremain's. He was at Ashmore House, in his study or in the library or walking the grounds of their London garden with the restless energy of a man renegotiating his own boundaries. Sylvie encountered him one morning in the breakfast room, earlier than his custom, before the post had arrived, before Ferris had brought the day's correspondence. He was sitting with a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at the chair across from him. Her chair. When she entered, he stood, not the perfunctory half-rise of a man acknowledging his wife's presence out of habit, but the full, deliberate rise of a man greeting someone whose arrival altered the room. He pulled out her chair. He had never done this before. In 4 years of marriage, the footman had always performed this duty, and Edmund had always been behind his newspaper. Sylvie sat. She said nothing about the chair. She poured herself tea from the pot and selected a piece of toast. But she noted it. She noted everything, as she always had. The difference now was that what she noted had begun to matter. Ferris reported to her on the Tuesday of the second week that the Duke had requested a full accounting of the estate improvements she had authorized over the past year. Not to review or challenge them, Ferris said, but to understand them. He'd spent an entire afternoon with the Ledgers, tracing her decisions through their outcomes, the repaired cottages, the new drainage on the North Field, the revised tenancy agreements that had reduced arrears by 1/3. Ferris said this with the careful neutrality of a steward who understood that he was reporting on a marriage, not an estate, and that the two were, in this household, no longer separable. Sylvie did not pursue him. She did not soften her terms or revisit the conversation in the drawing room. She continued to manage the household, to receive callers, to attend the engagements that required her presence. She was, in every observable particular, exactly the Duchess she had always been. The difference was that Edmund was now watching, and what he saw, because he was finally looking, was the scale of what she did. He saw that the menus were not simply competent, but strategic, that she calibrated every dinner party to the political alliances he was cultivating, that she seated his adversaries beside his most persuasive friends, that she chose wines that flattered the palates of men whose votes he needed. He saw that the household accounts she managed were not merely balanced but optimized, that she had renegotiated the coal contract, restructured the servants' wages to retain the best staff, and redirected savings toward the tenant cottages on the Ashmore estate, which she had been quietly improving for over a year without his knowledge. He saw that the letters she wrote, to his mother, to his political allies, to the wives of men he needed, were not social pleasantries, but a form of statecraft conducted with a subtlety that he, for all his parliamentary training, had never matched. He saw her. Miss Price departed London before the end of the season. Lady Tremaine, who understood the situation with the grim clarity of a woman who had survived her own marital disappointments, facilitated the withdrawal without protest. She called on Sylvie 3 days after the dinner, arriving at the precise hour when callers were received, announced by Mrs. Holt with the careful formality that suggested the housekeeper understood exactly who was arriving and why. Lady Tremaine sat in the drawing room with her gloves still on, which told Sylvie she did not intend to stay long, and said, "I did not know about the letter." "I believe you," Sylvie said. "I encouraged the friendship. I thought it was companionship. I was wrong." "You were not wrong. It was companionship. It was also more, and the more is what matters." Lady Tremaine nodded. She left within the quarter hour. They did not speak of it again, but the understanding between them, the particular unspoken compact of two women who had navigated the limits of what marriage permitted and what it demanded, endured. Miss Price accepted an invitation to stay with cousins in Derbyshire and did not return. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors, but they were muted by the simple fact that the Duke and Duchess of Ashmore appeared in the weeks following the dinner more united than they had been in years. Society, which valued the appearance of solidarity almost as much as solidarity itself, accepted the narrative and moved on. Edmund began, slowly, to occupy the spaces of his marriage that he had previously left empty. He appeared at breakfast, not as a man passing through on his way to his study, but as a man sitting down. He asked Sylvie about her plans for the day and listened to the answers. He consulted her on a speech he was drafting for the Lords, not as a formality, but because her revisions were better than his secretary's, and he had finally permitted himself to notice. One evening in late June, 6 weeks after the dinner, he came into the drawing room where Sylvie was reading and sat in the chair opposite hers, the same chair he had sat in the night of the dinner, which had, without either of them naming it, become his chair. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said, that I had failed to notice what you had earned." Sylvie lowered her book. "Yes, you were right that I mistook your competence for the natural order, but I think the failure was larger than that. I think I mistook your composure for indifference. I assumed that because you did not demand my attention, you did not require it. That was not a failure of noticing. It was a failure of imagination." "Yes," Sylvie said. "It was. I'm not a man who changes easily. You know this." "I do. But I am changing. Slowly and badly and with less grace than you would manage, but I am changing." Sylvie looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her book, set it on the table beside her, and said, "I know you are. I have been watching." It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was acknowledgment, and acknowledgment between two people who had spent years occupying the same house without inhabiting the same marriage was no small thing. The years that followed proved what the weeks had promised. Edmund became, by degrees and then by habit, and then by genuine inclination, the husband that Sylvie had not asked for but had deserved. He did not become demonstrative. That was not his nature, and Sylvie would not have trusted it if he had. He became attentive. He became present. He learned to ask questions not because the answers were useful, but because the asking itself was a form of regard. Their first child was born the following spring, a daughter whom they named Charlotte, and who had Sylvie's composure and Edmund's stubbornness, a combination that the household staff recognized immediately as formidable. A son followed 2 years later. George, quieter than his sister, with a habit of watching before speaking that reminded Sylvie, with a pang of recognition, of herself. Ashmore House filled with the particular noise of children being raised by parents who had learned through difficulty to occupy the same rooms. Edmund taught Charlotte to ride before she was 5. Sylvie found them in the stable yard one October morning, Charlotte perched on a gray pony with her hand steady on the reins, and Edmund walking alongside with his hand near the bridle, not touching it, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to let her believe she was managing alone. It was, Sylvie thought, watching from the library window, the precise balance he had learned to strike in their marriage, present without presuming, attentive without crowding. It had taken him 4 years and one letter read aloud in a dining room to learn it, but he had learned it, and the learning had held. Ferris, who had served the Ashmore estate for 23 years, once remarked to Mrs. Holt that the Duke had become a different man. Mrs. Holt, who had found the letter on the dining table that night and had read it and had said nothing, replied that the Duke had not become a different man. He had become the man he ought to have been from the beginning. The difference, she said, was that the Duchess had shown him the cost of being anything less. The letter itself was never spoken of again. Sylvie did not keep it. She did not destroy it. She simply allowed it to pass out of existence the way all letters eventually do, through the quiet, unremarkable erosion of time and relevance. It had served its purpose. It had been read aloud in a silent room, and the silence it had created had been, in the end, more eloquent than any words Edmund could have written. One evening, years later, when Charlotte was old enough to sit at the dinner table and young enough to ask impolitic questions, she looked at her parents across the roast and said, "Did you always love each other?" Edmund looked at Sylvie. Sylvie looked at Edmund. "Not always," Sylvie said, "but always enough." Edmund smiled, a real smile, not the performative curve of a man meeting social expectations, but the unguarded expression of a man who understood, finally, the value of the woman sitting across from him. "Your mother," he said to Charlotte, "is the most formidable person I have ever known, and I have sat in the House of Lords." Charlotte considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old assessing adult declarations. "More formidable than Lord Grenville?" she asked. "Significantly," Edmund said. Sylvie laughed. It was a sound that Edmund had not heard enough of in the early years of their marriage, and that he had learned in the later ones to value above almost anything, above eloquence, above admiration, above the kind of devotion he had once mistakenly believed could be found in a letter written to the wrong woman. The candles burned low. The children were taken up to bed. The house settled into the particular quiet of an evening that did not need to be remarkable because the life it contained was at last sufficient. They arrive here, like words read aloud in a silent room, impossible to take back, impossible to forget, and in the end, the truest thing ever spoken between them.